Okay, now we can get into the painting part. Let's make it so you can see all this stuff. Get my towel in there, water, and I have my photo reference taped up over here on the left. Just have yours close wherever you want it to be. And we're going to start by just putting water on one of the shells. Let's start with the top one. So make sure your brush is really clean, and your water is fresh, how you've gotten new water by now. And you're just going to brush water into the entire shell. Make sure not to go outside the edges, so be very careful around the outside edge. And just fill the whole thing with water. And actually I need to get all this stuff off my board so that I can tilt my board. So once you've got it wet, just kind of look at it in the light, make sure the whole thing is wet. I didn't quite get up to that edge, so I'm going to do that. Touch the towel and then tilt the board so all the water falls to one side and just soak up that drip. Go back and do it again if you need to so that there's no drip. The whole thing is just now damp. I got a little water right there too. And now we're just going to go in with the light yellow. And we're going to try to put the light yellow everywhere except on the very outside edge here, because as you can see in the photo reference, it's almost white there. There's just a hint of yellow. So we're going to get a brush full of yellow and just drop it in and let it bleed. Kind of push it around. If it does cover the whole thing, that's completely fine. Don't worry about it. Just try to leave a big gap of white showing about right there, approximately, on the right side. Rinse, touch your sponge, and go around and just kind of play with the yellow, force it around into every little corner if it's not doing it by itself. Rinse, touch, and then we'll just sop up any big drips by sort of dabbing. And then in the white area, if it looks like the yellow blended really beautifully on the edges, you can leave it. If you want to wipe it a little bit, you can, to just soften the edge between the white and the yellow. And it should stay, it should really stay where it belongs if you didn't have too much water to begin with. Now we're going to do something similar here. So we'll wet the second shell all the way around the edges. The beauty of a painting like this, where you have these three distinct areas you're working in, is while you're doing one area, another one can be drying. You can also use a blow dryer if you want to expedite drying, but it's nice to not have to do that every 5 seconds. So I've got that all wet. I'm going to look at it in the light. Yeah, it's all shiny. So I'm going to soak up the drip, touch my towel with the brush, soak up the drip. And you'll see I'm wiping the drip, which I've said not to do before, but that's because there's no color here, so it really doesn't matter. You can wipe all you want. You just don't want to wipe when there's color there unless your goal is to peel the color away, because that's what happens, is the color gets peeled away. So now we're going to put the yellow into this shell. Same thing, all over the whole thing except for a big area on the right where the brightest highlight is. And again, if it gets covered up, don't worry about it. You can pull it off, actually. I should have shown you that in the last shell, but let's just say for the sake of argument, oops, I painted the whole thing in yellow. So rinse, touch your sponge, and go back, and this is where when you wipe, you want to pull the color off. So I'm wiping to get it off, and then you're left with your big area of white, and you can go back and do that here too. This one's still wet, so you can do that at your leisure. And then we're going to do the same thing to the bottom one. Even though these are very different looking shells, in the end they start off the same, which is very interesting to me. Okay, so we got the water everywhere. Tilt the board, let the water fall down, soak it up, touch the sponge or towel, soak it up again, touch. Oops, I missed a spot. This is dry. And then we'll get the yellow and drop it in everywhere. Let it bleed all the way to the edge. And leaving a nice big white spot. I'm going to rinse, touch, and just wipe around that white spot, in that white spot, to get it to kind of blend with the yellow a little bit more. There's a big drip of yellow over here I'm going to soak up. So that's our first layer. Now, while this is drying a little bit, it doesn't have to be completely dry. Sometimes it works in your favor if you're painting into a slightly wet surface. Let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of the shadows, so we can use some terms here. So on a simple object, there's a when there's a light source, see the light source is coming from the right here because this is the lighter area and the shadow is being cast over to the left. So this is called the cast shadow because it's being cast. It's a very easy term to remember. And then there's parts of the cast shadow that are lighter and parts that are darker. So on these shells you can see the shadow's darkest here and here. It's usually darkest where the object touches the surface it's sitting on. And then as the shadow moves out away from the object, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. In this case, all three shells are darkest at the top and the bottom of the cast shadow, and there's light in the middle. Even though the shell is touching the surface all the way around, the reason it's light here, though, is because the light source is bouncing off the flat surface and back onto the shell. So it's kind of illuminating itself. The cast shadow is illuminating itself, as well as this little bit of light on the left side of each shell. And that bit of light on the left side of each shell is called reflected light for that same reason, it's being reflected. And then you'll see right next to it is the darkest part of the shell, and that's called the core shadow. The brightest highlight is called the highlight, and then the area kind of around the brightest highlight in the lit up area is called local color. That's the main color of your shell. So you may hear me use some of those terms. Oh, you know what? While I was talking, all this yellow fell down to the bottom of my bottom shell, so I'm going to just soak that up. But in general, if you have a good, strong light source on an object, you're going to have all of those elements of light and shadow on your object. Okay, so while I was talking, these dried a little bit. We still want them to be a little bit moist, so I'm going to start with the top one since that's the driest of the three, and I'm just tilting it to look at it in the light and make sure there's no big drips. You shouldn't really be able to see too much shine on it at this point. Unfortunately, you can't really touch it or you could, but you might leave a fingerprint, so you don't want to touch it. There's a little bit of guesswork involved, but part of the mystique of watercolor and the beauty of watercolor is its unpredictability, and although it has a kind of a bad reputation for that quality, it can be the most wonderful thing if you kind of work with the unpredictability and allow it to be what it is, and kind of let it lead you in a way. It's a very interesting process. So let's go. Okay, now we're going to go back up into here. Once again, my gray has sort of reintegrated, and the orange has floated to the top. I've actually never really seen watercolor do that before, and I don't know why that's happening, but I do know I don't want it to show up on my painting, so I'm going to stir it, scrape, and just retest. Okay, it's still gray. So I'm going to paint some gray in here, a little scary, and it's fairly dry, otherwise it would be spreading a lot. So I'm going to put it mostly on the left side and kind of down the center, bleeding a little bit there, and almost up to the top. Then rinse, touch, and let's go for some red next. Actually, my red is so saturated, I'm just going to take a little bit of it into a new cup here and add a brush full of water, because I really don't want to put on the darkest red yet. So let me see what happened when I did that. Don't be too concerned that the gray is drying. Yeah, that works fine. You're going to be kind of manipulating it and adding texture and whatnot, so if it's drying a little bit on you, that's fine. And believe it or not, you can actually blend it after it's dry as well. It's just not as smooth, maybe. So brush in a little bit of red there, rinse, touch your towel, and let's get rid of this edge while it's still kind of damp. So pointing your brush towards the edge, just sort of wipe up towards the top. It's really important that you're pointing towards the darker edge that you want blended, because if you're pointing the opposite direction, you won't be able to blend it. It'll just leave a different edge. And when I did that, I don't know if you can see this, but it actually left a little bit of a shadow on the right, or an edge on the right, so I'm going to blend that edge too, just wipe it off. And then at the very tip top, there's that orangey color, so I'm going to drop that in. Rinse, touch, and this is very drippy, so I'm just going to go back and dab at the bottom edge a little bit to soak it up. And I'm going to take this opportunity to not add lines on this shell yet, but just suggestions of lines. Just brush from the top down. Something like that. Now, I've still got a really harsh edge here, so I'm going to go back and wipe that again. And this time I'm pointing my brush down towards it, because I want to spread it out a little bit more. If I'm doing this, I just pointing at the edge, I just want to soften the edge, but now I really want to encourage that color to kind of come over and make more of a gradation. So I brush down and now I'm pulling it over to the right, and you can see it really blends beautifully there. Okay, so I'm going to leave that one for a little bit and move down to number 2 here, and we're going to do pretty much the same thing. Start with the gray. I'm going to stir mine up. Sorry you can't see this all. There we go. Stir this up, scrape so I don't come away with too much, and paint it in. Again, it's a little scary. You've got this gorgeous yellow shell, and now you're putting a big gray splotch on it, but try to let go and have faith that it will work out. And again, remember, this is watercolor. It does have a mind of its own. Don't go all the way over to the edge, because you want that beautiful reflected light on the right there. So you're just putting in the core shadow, and then I'm going to rinse, touch, grab a little bit of the ochre color and put that in at the very top. And that's where it's really the darkest orange, so I'm just going to paint it there, then rinse, touch, and use my damp wet brush and sort of just dab along the bottom to pull the ochre down into the gray. So what I was saying there was watercolor does have a mind of its own, and mine is not going to look the same as the original one I did, and yours is not going to look the same as either of these, and nothing's ever going to look the same, and that's part of the art of it. So enjoy it, and just don't fight it. You can go back and do that edge blend thing again. So I did it kind of laying my brush down, pointing towards the edge there, because I wanted that edge very soft, but I really want it to be more of a gradation the way it is over here. So I'm going to do the thing I did up here also, which is kind of pull the color over to the side a little bit. Then rinse, touch again, and blend again. I'm barely touching the paper. Over here, as long as you're coming at it pointing this way, it's fine. I'm going to awkwardly do it. I'm right-handed, so I'm awkwardly sort of like going over the camera and doing this. For you, I recommend just turning it upside down, because it's easier to do it that way. I just did that because I didn't want to move all my stuff and reposition the camera. And I'm just going in and dabbing into the gray a little bit to try to even it out. But it looks a little blotchy, and I'm going to leave it that way. It wants to be blotchy. Plus, these are seashells, which lend themselves to blotchiness. That's why it's such a great subject to do, especially for a first watercolor. Plus, they come from the ocean, where there's water. How's that for a metaphor? Yeah. Alright, so now we'll leave that one. Oh, actually, there's a little bit of a gray over here on the right side. Just a tad, so I'm going to put a teeny bit over here. Rinse, touch. Try not to get outside the shell like I just did, but if you do, don't panic. We're going to go back and touch things up a little bit later, and I'll show you how to do that. And then just wipe that off. And that makes that look nice and rounded. And now we'll go down to the bottom one. Bottom one is the darkest of all. So on that one, I think I'm going to start with the ochre on that one. The ochre, then the red, then the gray, because I want that gray to really stand out. And I feel like if I put it in now, I'll just kind of wash it out by using the ochre and the red. And this shell is the only one that's got that red really well blended into it. But I mean, this one has it too, but this one, as you can see, the red lines are really soft compared to these two. So I've got a brush full of ochre, and I'm going to drop that in at the top because it's pretty strong there, and a little bit about halfway down, and then a little bit on the right. So I've got 3 blotches, and then there's definitely some along the bottom edge, so I'm going to paint kind of a thick line, a little bit more paint, because I don't want to paint too dry, otherwise the color will go on lighter than I want. Something like that. Then I'm going to rinse, touch, and I still have some water in my brush on purpose, because I want this next red that I put in to be even waterier than the one I did at the top. Whoops. So let's test it. Yeah, that's nice and light. And I'm going to paint that in along the bottom edge, all the way up the center, just right kind of through that yellow, and then all the way up to this top. So it looks really odd right now. Don't worry about it. You're definitely going to just brush over this a bunch. I'm going to rinse, touch my sponge, and then go back and kind of encourage the color over to the right, just sort of dabbing at it. Similar to what I did up here where I just wiped, but now I'm dabbing because this is just a blotchier looking shell, so I don't want it to be that smooth. And I'm just going to wipe the color over here, and then I'm pointing my brush towards the right for this one. Again, you'll probably want to turn your board upside down. It's just easier to do it that way. And I've left some white here. I'm going to put some yellow into that area because it's yellow in the reference. Rinse, touch, and then down here I've got my white highlight, which I'm going to brush over, not only to brighten but to soften. And there's just a kind of a whole area of it right there. And then over here on the left, I'm going to point my brush towards that edge and wipe it to blend. And I want to encourage it to go all the way over to the left, but just very lightly. So I'm just going to take the tip of my brush and sort of whisper to it, please go over there. Dab a little bit. And now I'm going to put in the gray, which again has settled, so I'm going to stir it up and drop that in right here. My paint's now very wet, so you can see the gray is really going. But that's fine. I'm going to rinse, touch, and soak up the drip first. Rinse, touch, and then wipe, wipe, wipe. So just, yeah, you can just sort of push it around and make it do what you want it to do within your control. And I feel like I want a little bit more red in here too. So I'm going to dab some of that right into the gray. Rinse, touch, and just go back and soak up any major drips. And I'm pretty happy with that. So that's our second coat. We've already done the light yellows. Now we can go back and do some texturing.